It was one of the first bombers, built by the French and called the Caudron G4. During World War I, it menaced German troops with a rain of steel darts, which could penetrate a cavalryman's helmet, his body, and his horse. The deadly projectiles were released, somewhat quaintly, through a wooden door resembling a roll-top desk. There are only a few Caudrons left in the world, most like this one. Its cloth wings rotting, its paint peeling. Yet for one brief moment, it was considered the last word in airplane design, a leading edge of its day. This might have been our only memory of the Caudron, except for the efforts of a dedicated group of people who have chosen to preserve and restore the machines that enabled us to fly. This is the Paul E. Garber Preservation, Restoration, and Storage Facility, located just outside Washington, D.C. in suburban Maryland. Most people simply call it Silver Hill. Administered by the National Air and Space Museum, the Garber facility is the largest complex devoted to saving old aircraft in the world. It houses over 150 airplanes, many fully restored, and others, like the Caudron, which are preserved in storage, awaiting restoration. Aviation enthusiasts can arrange to tour the facility, and once a year they can learn some restoration techniques from the experts.
Picture what these articulated rods are doing. They're scribing varied ellipses all the way around. So if you take that into consideration, you don't get the same stroke on all of these pistons all the way around as you do on the one piston that has the master rod on it, because it's the only one that's scribing a true perfect circle inside the engine.
Pilots, private collectors, and people with vivid memories of flight come here to find out how they too can participate in preserving the past.
Well, I've always been fascinated by antique restoration of antique aircraft, and particularly World War II vintage aircraft is very, very fascinating. And most of these planes are disappearing as far as they're in their pristine state. They're just not around anymore. And to be able to see how they're being restored, see the ones that haven't been restored, it's just fascinating opportunity. I believe, and it's a little different from what the museum believes, I believe that if there's more than one plane left of a particular model, then you ought to fly that one. If it's the only one left, then I guess it's too valuable to fly, but I personally prefer to see them flown.
I think with aircraft, there is so much to learn and to know, and I'm not at that point yet that I know all of these aircraft. I've seen a lot of them, but I can't tell you exactly which one is which. The Stinson would be one that would be fun to go in. I just have a long way to go, and that's why it's a marvelous hobby, because I don't think you can ever stop learning. This seminar has been fantastic.
You lived and breathed it. You spent all your time, you built models, you read about it. I became an aero engineer, Navy pilot, and worked in the industry for 35 years. Always airplanes. And I guess it always will be.
For most of our history, we dreamed from below the clouds, looking up. The skies were playgrounds for birds, angels, and sometimes gods. Chained to Earth, the restless human mind began to devise a strategy for joining them. It seemed clear to even the earliest engineers that if we wanted to fly, we needed wings. But what kind of wings? Should they be long or short? Wide or narrow? Should they be modeled after a bird or a bat? A Greek myth tells of wings fashioned from feathers and wax that melted when Icarus flew too close to the sun, setting a pattern of failure that lasted century after century. Many innovative designs were put forward, but none of them succeeded in defying the law of gravity. Leonardo da Vinci designed wings that would operate by muscular effort, but even he was stymied in his attempts to fly. Success with gliders encouraged the ultimate dream, that one day a heavier-than-air craft, controlled by a man, would rise by its own power and fly. That day finally dawned on a windy beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on December 17th, 1903. Passing that first barrier was a psychological as well as a physical victory. To trespass into the ether of the gods was a risky and daring adventure for the human race. It required courage to go aloft and an airworthy machine to return safely. Soon the Wright brothers were joined by others, popularly known as aeronauts. They had successfully demonstrated the most elementary law of aviation, that in order to rise off the ground, an airplane must develop a lift force greater than its weight. Even the early pioneers knew that the faster the wing moves through the air, the more the lift. But the first engines were unable to propel an airplane at much more than 40 to 50 miles an hour. So increased lift had to be achieved in other ways. One solution was to add more wings. Eventually, this approach ran into the law of diminishing returns. Another solution was to experiment with the shape of the wing. Hundreds of different designs were tested. Some managed to get airborne. Most did not. New records for speed and altitude were constantly being set. One important breakthrough was the first powered flight across the English Channel, made by Frenchman Louis Blériot in 1909. At air shows in Europe and the United States, the public came out in force to witness the new phenomenon of flight and the old phenomenon of gravity. Women took to the air as well. The first to hold a pilot's license in 1910 was Raymonde de la Roche of France. For the first decade of powered flight, heroes and heroines abounded. The airplane was largely regarded as a novelty, the stuff of romance. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, new designs were rapidly and often prematurely pressed into service. Used primarily for observation and reconnaissance, airplanes were still dangerous machines for the men who flew them. Untested aircraft flown by inexperienced pilots frequently broke up in mid-air. One result of World War I was an aerial carnage that went largely unreported. A second result was an ongoing search for more sophisticated aviation designs and manufacturing techniques. Anthony Fokker used welded steel tubing on some of the aircraft he built for the Germans. He also refined the design of a slow but extremely maneuverable triplane, the DR-1. The German Albatross was streamlined for speed. The wings were still covered with fabric, but the body was now made of plywood. One airplane was made entirely of iron, the Junkers J-1. The Allies countered with more powerful engines in the Spads and the Sopwith Camels and Snipes. In the United States, the techniques of mass production were applied to manufacture over 3,000 of the British-designed de Havilland IV. By the end of the war, it was clear that military necessity had accelerated the pace of aeronautical progress. Engines had more than quadrupled in power. Metal had begun to replace wood and fabric in construction. War had made the airplane important. After the war, aircraft production plummeted. But the planes which had been built for the war and the pilots who had been trained to fly them remained. Together, they gave rise to the age of the barnstormers. Crisscrossing the country in their war-surplus planes, the barnstormers offered many Americans their first glimpse of aviation's apparently unlimited potential. But the daredevil antics of the Roaring Twenties caused numerous fatalities and hurt the growth of commercial aviation. Other post-war pilots flew for the U.S. Post Office. Their goal was to prove the reliability and safety of the airplane, a goal finally achieved by the courage and perseverance of one 25-year-old airmail pilot. When Charles Lindbergh piloted his specially designed Ryan monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours, he was merely the 92nd person to fly the Atlantic. But he was the first to do it alone and non-stop, and that made him a celebrity. He received 35 million pieces of mail from admirers around the world, and a hero's welcome wherever he went. When the Spirit of St. Louis landed in Paris on May 21st, 1927, it signaled the end of the first chapter of our romance with flight. There would be bigger and faster airplanes and new generations of pilots like Amelia Earhart to fly them. But there would never be another age like the golden quarter century from the Wright brothers to Lindbergh, when we took our first exuberant steps into the air. The better part of a century has passed since those early days of flight. Today, most of the pioneering planes are gone. Their engines corroded, their wood and fabric wings turned into dust. While many historic aircraft are preserved in museums, a few others can still be found standing silently in barns or hangars, mute witnesses to the golden age of aviation. And sometimes, not so mute. In the decades since these old planes braved the sky, there has been a surge of interest in keeping them alive, and for some, this means flying. With fewer and fewer originals still in existence, modern aeronauts have also begun building full-scale reproductions. Together, they constitute a living history of aircraft design, giving pilots born in the jet age a chance to experience what it was like to fly when airplanes were so slow, most of them didn't need brakes. Paul Palin has assembled a fleet of venerable aircraft at his airdrome in Old Rhinebeck, New York. On summer weekends, he and his team of pilots recreate the experience of the early air shows, when plane and pilot still flew close enough to the Earth to be seen. Here on a grass runway, some of the most celebrated early airplanes take to the air again. A Blériot 11, the first plane to fly the English Channel. The Sopwith Dolphin, a high-altitude fighter that followed the Sopwith Camel. The Fokker DR-1, a triplane like the one flown by the notorious Red Baron. The French Nieuport, one of the most elegant planes of the First World War. For most of us, exhibitions like the one at Old Rhinebeck afford our only chance to see the way the first flying machines flew. But a few of us still remember the real thing. Paul Garber, Silver Hill's founder, was born in 1899. He recalls seeing Orville Wright trying to pass a flight performance test at Fort Myer in 1909.
One day in the newspaper, I saw a picture of a big box kite. I made kites as a youngster, and here was this. I just made a box kite recently. Here was this enormous box kite, just tremendous, and the picture showed some men in it, and I thought how marvelous that is. So I made my way to the trolleys and out to Fort Myer. As I looked out, here was this great big box kite that I'd seen in the newspaper, with two men in it. And propellers on the back. I didn't know what they even called propellers. I probably called them whirlwells. But here it was coming toward me. And then it turned and went down this way to the other end of that big quadrangle at Fort Myer. Well, I began running after it. The aircraft went around a number of times because that was the time when the Wright airplane was trying to comply with the requirements of the specifications. One of the specifications was the airplane must fly for an hour with two persons.
Paul Garber has dedicated his life to collecting and restoring the aircraft that followed the Wright brothers and their early flying machines. The facility at Silver Hill that bears his name is the culmination of that effort. As a young man, Garber had dreamed of establishing a site where planes could be kept and restored. and he successfully convinced the Smithsonian Institution to acquire a piece of land in nearby Maryland. When the Smithsonian's aviation collection was transferred to Silver Hill in the early 1950s, the area was little more than a swamp. A few temporary buildings were erected to house parts of the collection. But because space was limited, many aircraft had to be left outside. Rain and sun, wind and snow took their toll. Between the wings of parked planes, trees and vines grew up. But all this changed in 1971, when plans for the construction of the National Air and Space Museum, approved 9 years earlier, were revitalized. Silver Hill became an indispensable source of restored aircraft that one day would be displayed next to Garber's most famous acquisition, the airplane that carried Charles Lindbergh across the Atlantic.
I had a homemade radio in my car, and I put the thing on, and it said that Lindbergh had just taken off for Europe. And so I hurried to get to the office, and the more I thought about him, the more I thought about the museum, and the more I realized what a marvelous thing it would be if he were to be the one to be the first to cross the Atlantic solo. When I got into work, I then wrote a cablegram, and I thought, well, now, Lindbergh won't know me. I know him, because he was in Air Mail Service. I know about that. But he won't know Garber. But he'll know the Secretary of the Smithsonian. So here I, all presumptuous, went to see the Secretary of the Smithsonian. I said, Dr. Abbott, coming into his office, have you read the paper? Have you seen that Lindbergh has taken off already? He said, yes. He said, I heard that. I heard that on the radio. Well, I said, sir, we ought to have that airplane, sir. It'll be a good one for the collection, sir. And that'll be a marvelous flight, and it's a good airplane, and a good engine, and good instruments, and we ought to have that, sir, for the collection. It had about half an hour from me with all those sirs in it. And then he said, oh, now, Garber, he hasn't gotten there yet. He's only as far as New England. I said, yes, sir, we're going to make it, sir. Got a good airplane, sir. He'll make it. And Dr. Abbott said, oh, now, we'll see. And down goes his head as he looked toward the door. But I left the cablegram on his desk, and it was sent.
Lindbergh got the cable, and the Smithsonian got the spirit of St. Louis. Today, it is part of the extensive collection of aircraft at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The popularity of the museum attests to our continuing love affair with flight. Every year, millions of people visit National Air and Space to see for themselves the aircraft that made history. Planes like the Lockheed 5B Vega, which Amelia Earhart flew nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean in 1932. The Curtiss P-40E Warhawk, with its distinctive shark mouth, which flew to fame with the Flying Tigers. The Bell X-1, also known as Glamorous Glennis, which Chuck Yeager flew faster than the speed of sound in October 1947. Other experimental aircraft, like the X-15, signaled our readiness to fly beyond the skies into a realm reachable only by rockets and the brand new technology of space that gave us machines like the Apollo 11 command module. And this is the machine that started it all, the 1903 flyer that carried Orville and Wilbur Wright into history on the dunes at Kitty Hawk. It was donated to the Smithsonian after the Second World War, which it spent safe from bombs in a London subway tunnel. When the technicians from Silver Hill restored the flyer, their progress was recorded by time-lapse photography. Time is the greatest enemy of the restorer. As the years pass, fabric and wood rot. Metal corrodes. It is a process of decay that must be constantly fought. Sometimes the original materials can be refurbished and used. If they are damaged beyond repair, the restorers try to find replacement materials from the same era. Robert Mickish is one of the Smithsonian's curators in charge of overseeing much of the work at Silver Hill. Since each airplane is restored to a specific time in its history, each presents a puzzle as to the proper parts and equipment. It's up to Mickish to pick a time period and to ensure that the restoration is historically accurate.
Carl, what are we going to do?
His current project is the only operational jet bomber of the Second World War, the German-built Arado 234. Only a few were produced, and this is the only one that survived.
In the first place, but do we have another one in the collection that we can get to that match?
Yeah.
Well, as a curator in a restoration, my responsibility is providing the guidelines that describe to the technician what the airplane is supposed to be like when it is completed. That not only concerns colors, but the equipment that goes inside the airplane. Should it have this type of radio or should it have that type of radio? Because many of them come to us without these details. So I give them the, shall we say, the bottom line to work toward. In the case of the Arado 234 here, we have a perfect example of the change from propeller-driven airplanes to jet aircraft, or, as you would, the jet age. We started World War II with propeller aircraft, no jets at all. And by the time the war ended, all nations were thinking jet aviation. The Americans had them, the British had them, the Germans, of course, had them operational. So that is really where it all began. One of the most difficult parts of a restoration when working up the guidance that goes with it is to determine the parts that are missing and then to find them. What we try to do is establish a time of which the airplane is to be restored to. Either that is factory finish when it comes out, or when it's assigned to the operational unit. It could be when the Americans captured it. But in this case, it's restored to as it was, to the best of our ability, as it was when it was operational in the Luftwaffe. We restore an airplane, in our way of thinking, that it's going to last 300 or 400 years. But we do have to accept that there are certain parts of an airplane, or materials, I should say, that are expendable. I anticipate from our experience here in the museum that after about every 50 years, our restored airplanes are going to have to be repainted. Tires and fabric last about 75 years and would have to be restored or replaced, really. But the structures, whether they're wood or metal, are going to survive by the way that we feel that we've restored them. So we're not going to be able to do a restoration and expect it to last untouched for 300 or 400 years.
Karl Heinzel is recreating one of the recovery parachutes for the Arado's rocket-assisted takeoff.
What I'm doing here is making a template so that we can sew these bags up. These are parachute bags, or they will be parachute bags that go on the rocket unit. And this is the only bag that we had in the collection that would fit the bill, and it's the only type that we have. The parachute in the bag is wrong, but the type of bag itself is correct. Unfortunately, we only have one of them, and so we're going to have to make duplicates for the rocket motors themselves. A lot of airplanes have a sort of a national personality. You can tell by the way they were built as to who built them. Generally speaking, Japanese airplanes are built very lightly. The metal is very thin, and they have a lot of complicated systems in them, mostly hydraulic, and they are actually a lot of trouble to work on. They're very hard to work on. British airplanes also are very complicated and have a lot of little tiny parts in them. Things with little tiny parts are always a lot of trouble. And the French, generally speaking, take a lot of time in manufacturing aesthetically pleasing parts. I guess that's the best way to describe it. There's a practical purpose to it in that they're trying to save weight or whatever, but they're nonetheless very time-consuming to make. Generally speaking, American airplanes are straightforward even if they're complicated, and they're relatively easy to work on, not necessarily as easy as the German airplanes, but nonetheless a lot easier than, say, the French or British or Japanese airplanes, certainly. The German airplanes, on the other hand, are very, very straightforward, usually with a minimum amount of systems in them. Just enough to get the job done. The pieces, generally speaking, are large. And in the case of this airplane, which was built, the Dorado, towards the end of the war, the airframe was slave labor built. And the reason it looks this nice is because there's a lot of putty on it, but that's the authentic way that the Germans made them. They just nailed them together and then put putty on it. But the systems are very simple, generally speaking, and they're easy to work on. One of the really interesting things about the airplane, well, one real interesting thing is that it was the first airplane I know of to operate with a drag chute. This little door right here are the operating doors for the parachute container. And when we took this out, we heard a peculiar rattle in it, and so we opened the doors up and found that whoever had built this had put a rock in it. There was a spring mechanism in it that unlatches the door and allows the chute to come out. And there was a rock placed in it by the person who built it in the hopes that this rock would jam the mechanism and the chute wouldn't deploy in the airplane and go off the end of the runway. So it was a way of a person who was either interned or captured or whatever of continuing to fight on in the war. It's something to really remember about this. Again, this is built late in 1944, and the Germans were doing anything they could to get anything in the air. And the airframe itself was built by unskilled labor, and labor who had a vested interest in seeing it crash. One of the things that makes the shop as interesting as it is to work in, plus as effective as it is to work in, is that a large number of the people in the shop come from a strictly mechanical background, either in the service or the airlines or both. And some of the rest of us come from a more artistic and historical background in the aviation. And the combination of the two types of people make it very effective. We're able to produce mechanical art, as it were, when it's done.
Producing historically accurate mechanical art takes time. It took nearly 2.5 years to restore this SPAD-13, which shot down 4 enemy planes during the First World War. Just over 3 years were needed to renovate the Focke-Wulf 190 F-8, one of Germany's best all-round fighters of World War II. This particular DH-4 was the first combat airplane off the assembly line in the United States. Called a flaming coffin because of its tendency to catch fire, it took over a year to restore. The original owner of this Benoit Type 12 was killed flying it. Built in 1911, it was the first aircraft made in America with its engine in the front, and took 18 months to be restored. The National Air and Space Museum restores aircraft in order to preserve the technology, and therefore does not fly its airplanes. With the number that still fly dwindling, one young pilot has been collecting rides in vintage aircraft. Martha Esch has crisscrossed the United States, but she's never flown in a Curtiss Jenny until today.
This may be the most exciting flight I've ever had. Cole Palin, who runs Rhinebeck Aerodrome here, has just offered me a ride in his Jenny. and it'll be, for sure, the oldest airplane I've ever been in. And there are so few of them left in the entire world, and I really didn't think that I could get a ride in it because it's just a real rare opportunity, and this will be a real treasure in my logbook.
The Jenny probably trained more early American pilots than all other planes combined. The novice sat in the front seat with a set of controls that could be overridden by the experienced pilot behind.
Okay, Martha, we're going to make like a big bird. You have a rudder bar.
Slow and underpowered, the Jenny was forgiving enough to let young pilots solo after about a dozen hours of training. Even with constant maintenance, the older airplanes have a limited life in the air. Every time an original plane goes aloft, there is a chance that it won't return in one piece. That's what happened to the Great Lakes trainer. An accident grounded the airplane for many months while original parts were sought. And the difficulty of finding parts means that substitutes must often be made.
Well, you have to do the repair in a practical manner because it has to fly. So there's no question about that. And you try to do it in an authentic manner. Do it as it was done or would have been done in that period.
But for those who choose to fly older airplanes, safety must always supersede historic authenticity. As time passes, some airplanes become more valuable or less airworthy. Cold Sopwith Snipe is such a plane, and he's agreed to lend it to the National Air and Space Museum, where Carl Schneidy is working on plans for the World War I gallery.
We want to upgrade the airplane. It wouldn't be a restoration, but really a cosmetically to make it acceptable to the Albatross and the other aircraft that are absolutely perfect. Gordon did a great job, but it's been many years.
It's been many years, and a change of temperature and all the, paint chips.
Sure. We would use the British brown overall color scheme, retaining the original markings on the aircraft, saving the rondelles where possible. The nose would be painted the dark gold gray, including the black panel. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I do have photographic evidence of natural wood turtle deck, and it is kind of nice.
Yeah.
So we'll leave that wood there. It'll sort of allow the airplane to look a little bit nicer.
Sure.
Palin has also agreed to lend the Smithsonian his reproduction of the FE-8, which saw action in World War I. Called a pusher, the FE-8 had its propeller in the rear, unsafely mounted just behind the cockpit, in perfect position to crush the pilot in the event of a crash landing.
Well, maybe with this airplane, we can tell the story a little more. We're very excited about using this FE-8. Basically, the airplane, our desire is to borrow the airplane to show the hostile environment in which the pilots flew. What we would do then to this airframe would install it in the gallery. Before that, of course, we would take it to Silver Hill and make a cutaway of the nacelle. what we'd like to do is to install a mannequin with full flying gear, RAF flying gear, RFC, and describe what it was like to fly in an airplane at this time period. Literally sitting on the floor of this fuselage nacelle with a backrest of the gas tank showing the instrumentation.
Well, with me, it's always a case of we get a new airplane and we
Sure.
have fun. See? So we've had our fun with this, and I'm glad to see it go somewhere where it can be seen more and appreciated.
Palin's experience with all sorts of old aircraft has enabled him to evaluate their peculiar characteristics and idiosyncrasies firsthand from the cockpit.
The thing is, the advantage that we have today is that we know airplanes fly.
Right.
And I'm afraid the young types that flew the planes then, this was the greatest thing going, no question about it, but they had very little experience in any kind of an airplane.
Any moving object, even the chauffeurs were rare in
That's
World War
right,
I.
exactly. So a horse, some of the, I'm sure, types never even driven an automobile. Of course, everybody asks, what is it like to fly these airplanes? Are you ever scared? I'm scared all the time. But when something does happen, you're not scared because you're so damn busy that you don't have time to be scared, But any airplane, I really don't fly the airplanes. I just suggest things to the airplanes.
Right.
And if they don't want to go along with me, really, that's okay. I'm not going to push hard.
You're along for the ride.
Along for the ride.
For the first generation of aircraft, achieving enough lift with greater control was the paramount technical problem. In the 1920s, designers turned their attention to improving the airplane's power. The faster a plane goes, the smaller its wing can be, and still produce the same lift. Engines cooled by air rather than water grew in popularity. Lighter and more reliable, they became the standard of the world for the next 20 years. In the 1930s, a propeller was introduced whose angle of attack could be changed while in flight. These and other improvements, like the increased use of duraluminum, produced a new generation of aircraft that could carry larger loads over longer distances. Commercial aviation became not only possible, but profitable. Flight had truly matured in the 1930s. When war began to engulf Europe in 1939, the airplane assumed an importance equal to battleships and tanks. Dive-bombing Stukas helped Germany to crush Poland in a matter of weeks. The Battle of Britain was fought in the skies over England and the Channel, pitting German Messerschmitt 109s and 110s against British Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. All four fighters were built with the idea of achieving maximum performance. When Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese in 1941, Americans were introduced to a combat plane known as the Zero. no British or American fighter of the time could match its maneuverability. The United States responded with a rapid increase in airplane production. The 2,000 aircraft produced in 1939 swelled to nearly 100,000 in 1944. The queen of the skies over Europe during the war was the B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress. Long-range escort fighters like North American's P-51 Mustang had a combat radius of 850 miles, helping the Allies carry the war to the skies over Germany. In the Pacific, the workhorse was the B-29 Superfortress. It delivered over 90% of the explosives dropped on Japan during the war, including a new kind of bomb that was detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945, and abruptly changed the nature of war forever. The B-29 that dropped the first atomic bomb was called the Enola Gay. It is currently being restored at Silver Hill and is scheduled to go on display in the 1990s.
The only difficulties we've run into are basically two. The first one being the equipment dealing with the atomic bomb. This was still classified when we brought it into the restoration shop. We were able to get several photographs declassified, and using those in the aircraft itself, we were able to make the bomb rack. The second problem, which is a problem with all our airplanes, is just finding missing parts. The airplane came off the assembly line as a standard B-29 and modified in the fact that they took all the guns off except for the tail gunner's position, all the armor plate, different electrical equipment, and the modifications that were put in were the bomb rack, special carrying racks for spare parts, electric propellers, air-operated doors. The historical aspect of the airplane not only revolves around the day it dropped the bomb, but within 1 or 2 days after the mission. The pilots' names were put on the airplane, the ground crew's name was put on it. So we're restoring the airplane back to within 2 to 3 days of its date of dropping the atomic bomb.
Yet even before the dawn of the nuclear age, aircraft engineers had been experimenting with new sources of power, of hidden energies waiting to be unleashed and controlled. As early as 1940, it was clear to designers that pistons and propellers had reached the outer limits of their ability, 469 miles per hour, a mark set in April 1939. Shortly before the end of the war, German technology had produced much faster airplanes, the first operational jets. The Arado 234 could fly at about 470 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt 262 had been clocked at 525 miles per hour. Another German innovation was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered flying wing designed to decrease drag. Jet and rocket power were clearly the wave of the future. In a jet, air is gathered into the engine and compressed by fan blades. Fuel is mixed with the air and ignited. The resulting blaze produces hot gases, which escape out the rear of the engine. The reaction to the escaping gases is called thrust. Rocket engines operate on similar principles, but don't require an external oxygen source. From the mid-1940s on, the U.S. began to build a series of research aircraft. Many were tested in the Mojave Desert. One of the earliest goals of the test pilots was to fly faster than the speed of sound, about 760 miles per hour at sea level under certain conditions. An airframe shaped like a bullet was settled on, partly because bullets were known to surpass the speed of sound. On October 14, 1947, the rocket-propelled Bell X-1, piloted by Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager, passed through the wall popularly considered to be impenetrable by man. Further advances in speed, altitude, and power challenged us to transform our aircraft into spacecraft. In the lifetime of one man, the technology of flight had carried men from a few feet above the sands of Kitty Hawk to the surface of the moon. It had sent men walking through space and cameras beyond the rim of the solar system. And the machines which accomplished these feats had evolved from wood and cloth contraptions into the most complex vehicles ever built. Yet even a technology as recent as that of space has its relics. Lynn Ezell directs the day-to-day operations at the Garber facility. Among her many duties are the maintenance of the Smithsonian's collection of artifacts which have been beyond the Earth's atmosphere.
We're inside one of NASA's environmentally controlled storage units. This cabinet contains spacesuits from the Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury days. This Gemini spacesuit we acquired in 1973, but only during the last 10 years has it had the kind of stable environment that it needs. You can see that the spacesuit contains many different kinds of materials: a metal ring which connected to the helmet, ports for the oxygen, metallized material for the bulk of the suit, and the gloves, which are also connected by metal rings. You can see that the spacesuit wasn't always stored under the best of conditions. The glove is neither as white nor as flexible as it once was because it's been stored in the wrong kind of environment. These lunar training boots are quite interesting. Again, made of several different kinds of material: metal buckling, Teflon, nylon. This astronaut's boots from an earlier period, again from Gemini, and you can tell upon close inspection of the zipper that it had corroded when it was kept in an unsuitable environment. This early Gemini helmet is missing its visor, but it does have the earphones. Earphones made of foam and cotton material with a metal helmet. The Apollo extravehicular suits had gold-plated visors to protect the astronauts while they were on the surface of the moon.
Since modern aircraft tend to be a good deal larger than their older counterparts, The Smithsonian is always on the lookout for additional space to house them, not too far from a long runway.
With the acquisition of objects like the Space Shuttle, the Concorde, a C-130, obviously we can't bring them to Silver Hill. Their size is a problem. They can't be broken down like some of the older spacecraft and aircraft can be. So we're faced with finding off-site storage for them. So we need an off-site facility with access to a runway and access to a large modern runway and control center. And what we hope to find is an airfield near the Washington, D.C. area at which we can build an extension.
When the Smithsonian finally gets its extension and can house its shuttle, Paul Garber will have witnessed yet another victory for those dedicated to the vision that has fueled his imagination for nearly a century. The dream of preserving the machines that enabled us to fly.
I'm not an accomplished pilot, but I'm certainly an enthusiastic one and a rather reverent one. And there was one time when I was flying, and I became impressed by the beauty of it. And I tried to put that into words. And we have a movie here that's called To Fly. I started off with that. To fly, dear God in heaven, to fly, to see thy world from thy vast sky, to pilot my airplane high and low, to ride the wind wherever I go, to rise through clouds, and suddenly a burst of light in the sun I see. Climbing higher, I look below and see that the clouds are as white as snow. I know that the world is way down there, but I'm above all worldly care. Onward I fly, alone, serene, immersed in a wonderful, beautiful scene. But then at last I must go down again to earth's gray shadows, to mankind's domain. But my heart is enriched, my soul lifted high, because for a while I was up in thy sky.
Founded in 1846, the Smithsonian Institution is now the world's largest museum and research complex. In Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian operates 13 museums, exploring an incredibly diverse range of knowledge. The wonders of planet Earth and the life it supports. The history of the United States. Magnificent works of art from this country and from around the world. And the story of human flight. Also in Washington is the National Zoo, a center for wildlife research. Elsewhere, the institution operates the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory,